It's a great pleasure to be in this beautiful city, and I've had a chance to look at some of the old city today. It's also a great pleasure to be able to speak to you here in Krakow, where I've never been before, in English. You've gone to all the time and trouble to learn English, and it makes it much easier for me, and I really appreciate the fact you've done that. I can assure you this would not work reciprocally. If anyone went from Poland and gave a talk in London, no one would understand it, except other Poles, of course. The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. And it's supported, it's made more convincing by the tremendous triumphs of technology. Modern medicine, jet planes, the internet, modern technologies, smartphones. All these things make it look as if science must be right because it underlies all these completely transformative things that are happening in our world. Very few people question the underlying doctrines of science. And yet, what's happened in the sciences is that the method of science, inquiry, critical discussion, hypothesis, empirical evidence, the scientific method is very powerful and continues to be essential. But the sciences have become trapped in a kind of dogmatic belief system or worldview, which has been in place since the late 19th century. It's not really science, it's a set of assumptions which are part of a philosophy of nature, the philosophy of materialism. The materialist philosophy says that matter is the only reality, and that everything's made of matter, and that matter is fundamentally unconscious. We live in an unconscious, machine-like universe. So that's the basic assumption of materialism. There are 10 basic dogmas on which the modern science is based. I'm going to list the 10. I won't have time to discuss them all this evening. But to start with, the first of them is that nature is mechanical. Nature is like a machine. The universe is like a machine. Animals are like machines. Plants are like machines. And we're like machines. Our brains are computers. Our eyes are cameras. Our hearts are pumps. In the words of Richard Dawkins, we are lumbering robots. We are just machines. That's the first assumption. And of course, this isn't really a testable theory, it's just a metaphor. The old metaphor, which everyone in Europe believed until the 17th century, was that nature was like an organism. The whole universe was like an organism. Animals and plants were organisms. The earth was a living organism. The stars were organisms with a consciousness of their own. It was a completely different way of thinking of nature. The mechanistic revolution in science replaced the idea of animate organism with the idea of inanimate machinery. The second assumption, which I've already mentioned, is that everything's made up of matter, or physical substance, which is unconscious. The third assumption is that all of this is governed by eternal laws of nature that were already there at the moment of the Big Bang. The mathematical laws of nature are fixed. They've always been the same, they always will be the same, and they were there at the moment of the Big Bang. The fourth assumption is the total amount of matter and energy in the universe is always the same, or at least since the Big Bang, when it all suddenly came into being. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant at the moment of the Big Bang. The fifth assumption is that nature is purposeless. The universe is a machine, it has no purpose, evolution has no purpose. We're here as a result of blind forces of natural selection and chance mutations. The sixth assumption is that memories are stored inside the brain. Everything you remember is stored somewhere inside your head. No one quite knows how. Attempts to find these memories have failed, but the assumption is that it must all be inside the head. If everything's material, memory must be material, and therefore it must be in your brain. And this fits very well with the materialist argument, which was essentially atheistic, because if all your memories are inside your brain, when you die and your brain decays, all your memories will be wiped out. Everything to do with your personal identity will be destroyed. So all religious ideas about survival of bodily death must be untrue if you believe this materialist theory. The seventh assumption is that biological inheritance is material. Everything you inherit is inherited materially in your genes or in epigenetic modifications of the genes. Of course, there's also cultural inheritance, but biological inheritance is thought to be material. The eighth assumption is that minds are nothing but the activity of brains. Your mind is your brain. Minds are what brains do, as many materialist philosophers express it. Your entire conscious mind is the activity of your brain that's inside your head. The next assumption is that psychic phenomena like telepathy are illusory. They can't possibly exist because the mind is in the brain. Therefore, your thoughts or intentions can't possibly influence other people many miles away because it's all inside your head. And the 10th assumption is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. The body's a machine, you're a machine, the brain's a machine. Therefore, the only ways to treat it are physical, through surgery, or chemical, through drugs. And of course, surgery has made astonishing improvements. There are many amazing drugs, and we all depend upon them. But this view of medicine as dealing only with the physical and the chemical is a very limited view. But nevertheless, from the point of view of the mechanistic medicine assumption, it's the only kind that really works. All alternative and complementary therapies, all miraculous healings, all healings through prayer or through pilgrimage must be illusory, or if they happen at all, they're nothing but the placebo effect. But of course, the placebo effect is itself unexplained because what it shows is that our expectations and hopes affect our medical recoveries. Well, these are the 10 basic assumptions which are not usually taught as a series of doctrines. They're simply absorbed by people as they go through the educational system by a kind of intellectual osmosis. If they were spelled out more clearly, it would be easier to look at them skeptically. But most people don't even realize they're making these assumptions. They don't think they're assumptions, they just think they're the truth. So the kind of atheistic skeptics that all of us encounter from time to time who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, don't think that what they have is a belief system. They think they know the truth. Everyone else has belief systems, Catholics, Protestants, Hindus, Muslims, etc. But what they know is the truth. Well, what I'm arguing is it's not the truth. It's a set of assumptions. And what we need to do is apply the spirit of radical skepticism to look at these assumptions on which contemporary science itself is based. It's a thoroughly scientific thing to do, to look scientifically at assumptions. When we do that, we find that very few of these assumptions are supported by evidence at all. Every single one of them turns out to be deeply questionable. And when we question these assumptions, when we look at the alternatives, all sorts of new possibilities open up. I think that these assumptions constrict science and stop it from expanding and growing in a way that it could. I'm going to start with the assumption that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. This is something all of us learn at school, the principle of conservation of matter and energy. It applies to closed systems, but the whole universe is supposed to be a closed system. and so therefore the total amount in the universe is supposed to be the same. Now, most people never dream of questioning this assumption. I didn't question it myself until a few years ago. Having had a scientific education, I'd questioned most of the others, but this is the last one that I thought of questioning. But when you actually look at it, it turns out that it's not at all as simple as it first seems. Physicists themselves are much less intimidated by the so-called laws of nature than the rest of us. They, after all, are the people who codify the laws of nature. As soon as galaxies were discovered in the 20th century, it became clear that the galaxies, the stars in the galaxies, were being held together much more than they ought to be if it all just depended on gravitation, based on the amount of matter in the stars, perhaps in dark stars, in planets, in gas clouds. The galaxy has much more gravitational effect on its stars than it ought to have. If you just had the amount of the ordinary matter, the galaxies would fall apart. The stars would be flung out. They'd cease going round in orbit. And moreover, different galaxies attract each other in a way that's more than they ought to if it's just a matter of the known amount of matter in them. This was a big problem for physicists, and it was proposed first in the 1920s and 30s, but no one took it that seriously then, but increasingly often until it became mainstream in the 1980s, that there must be an extra kind of matter in galaxies which we couldn't see, which we know nothing about, but which has to be there to explain the behavior of galaxies. The assumption is that the existing scientific theories of gravitation must be correct, and if they don't fit the facts, then there must be more matter there than we knew about. How much more matter? Well, simple. You just work out how much more matter you need to balance the equations and titrate in that amount of matter. That's the amount of dark matter there is. If the equations show the galaxy ought to be behaving differently, put in a bit more dark matter, add in some here, take away some there. Since no one knows what it is and can't observe it, it's entirely up to physicists to tell us how much there is, and they can adjust the amount at will. They've created something like 4 or 5 times more matter than ordinary matter at the stroke of a pen. Having created all this extra dark matter, the mass of the universe became much greater than it was thought to be before. So much so that there ought to be extra gravitation that would stop the universe expanding until it finally stopped expanding and began to contract again, and it would all end in the opposite of the Big Bang, known as the Big Crunch. Well, around 1999, it was discovered that the universe is not, in fact, expanding slower and slower. It's expanding faster and faster, contrary to the expectations of physicists based on the amount of dark matter in the universe. So how do we explain that? Well, simple. There must be another form of energy, called dark energy, that pushes the universe apart. How much is there? Just the right amount to explain the facts. So we now have a situation where 95% of the universe is made up of dark energy and dark matter, and we haven't a clue what they are. We don't know what they do, apart from the things they're supposed to do to make the equations work. We don't know if they can be converted into regular matter and energy, or regular matter and energy can turn into dark matter and energy, in which case it would just disappear. So this is an extraordinary situation. Physics has shown us that we literally know nothing, or next to nothing, about 95% of physical reality. So how can we be sure that the total amount of dark matter and dark energy is always the same? Well, actually, we can't. The equations of dark energy say that the amount per unit volume is constant. So as the universe expands, the amount of dark energy increases. The universe is now a perpetual motion machine. Well, these are extraordinary aspects of physics. They completely change the old view that we were brought up with, that we thought we knew about matter and energy and what they were. We don't know. And it may be they don't even exist. It may be that if we had a different theory of gravitation or a different theory of galactic organization, it wouldn't be necessary to suppose that these unobserved materials and energies actually exist. Well, that's one area where there's a huge amount still unknown. And this is relatively uncontroversial. This is pretty standard physics nowadays. What I want to turn to now is the assumption that matter is unconscious. This is one of the most fundamental assumptions of the materialist worldview. To understand how we got to our present situation, it's helpful to look at the history. In the 17th century, when the scientific revolution took place, the view of matter that we now have was first formulated by René Descartes, the French philosopher, who was one of the first people to put forward the idea the universe is a giant unconscious machine. Animals are machines, plants are machines, and we're machines. Descartes made a famous dualistic separation between the world of matter. Matter is unconscious and it's in space and time. The whole universe is made of matter. But there was another reality, spirit, which was not in space and time, not physical, and basically immortal and timeless. And this was not part of the realm of science. The realm of spirit, in Descartes' view, included three basic components: God, angels, and human minds. Those were outside space and time, and there was this radical dualism between unconscious nature and conscious minds. So this led to an extreme split. It meant that humans were totally different from all other animals, so it's okay to vivisect them or factory farm them because they're just machines, whereas we have this rational spirit. It led to a radical split between mind and body, because the mind is immaterial, the body is material, and nobody could explain how this immaterial spirit could influence the body. And it led to a radical split between the realms of science and religion. Religion got God, angels, and human minds together with human morality. Science got the entire physical universe, including human bodies and brains. And God was, as it were, withdrawn from the universe. The universe now became automatic machinery that worked by itself with no need for God. God's realm was confined just to human minds, angels, and the spiritual realm. This was totally different from the view in the Middle Ages, where God was within nature as well as beyond it, where all nature was alive. The whole universe had a kind of soul. The earth was a living organism. The philosophy of nature that gave us the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe was radically different from this mechanistic philosophy that we've grown so used to. In the 19th century, a lot of people thought we don't want two things, matter and spirit. Two's too many. We just want one thing. Some philosophers said spirit's the only reality. That's the idealist school of philosophy. But many philosophers said, no, matter's the only reality. There's no such thing as spirit. God and angels simply don't exist. And human consciousness is just something to do with the brain. So at one stroke, they shifted the philosophy from dualism to materialism, mechanistic materialism, the current orthodoxy of science. It has been since the late 19th century, and got rid of God and angels, the whole spiritual realm. All spirits disappeared. But human consciousness remained, and the continued existence of human consciousness is what is causing this mechanistic materialist worldview to break up. It's happening before our very eyes. Because for decades, scientists just ignored consciousness. They didn't think or talk about it. They assumed it was nothing but brain activity. So all you need to do is just look at brains and study nervous systems in more detail, and finally you'll understand consciousness. But in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a growth of an area of science called consciousness studies, where scientists have started looking at the nature of consciousness itself, not just ordinary psychology, but mystical experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, and a whole range of religious and spiritual experiences. Meanwhile, there's been an enormous growth of spiritual practices like meditation, in which many people are doing practices which deal with the very basis of consciousness itself. So the situation has changed, and there's now a debate about consciousness. Is it just the brain? And if it is just the brain, why should unconscious matter in the brain give rise to conscious minds? That's why in the philosophy of mind, the very existence of human consciousness is called the hard problem. It's the hard problem because you cannot solve this problem within materialist terms. Some materialist philosophers of mind argue that consciousness doesn't really exist. It ought not to exist in a materialist world, and in fact, it doesn't exist. Or if it does, it doesn't do anything. It's just a kind of epiphenomenon of what goes on in our brains, like a kind of shadow that doesn't do anything. Or, as some of them suggest, that consciousness is an illusion produced by brains. The trouble with that, of course, is it doesn't solve the problem, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. You can't have an illusion unless you're conscious. So it presupposes consciousness. So this debate has gone round and round in circles around the hard problem. And one of the things that has happened is that some materialist philosophers have said, okay, we've got to get a way out of this, and the best way out of it is to abandon old-style materialism and adopt a philosophy called panpsychism. Pan means everywhere, psyche means mind or soul or spirit or mind or soul. And so the idea is that there's some kind of mind, even in electrons or atoms, that everything in nature has not just bodies, but some kind of mind. And therefore, the emergence of consciousness in humans is not a difference of kind, something totally different emerging from inanimate machinery, but a difference of degree, a more complex form of consciousness emerging from less complex forms of consciousness. This philosophy of panpsychism is not new. It's basically a modern version of what used to be called animism, the belief that there are psyches or souls throughout nature. Philosophy in Christian Europe in the Middle Ages was essentially animist. The philosophy of Aristotle, modified by St. Thomas Aquinas, taught that all animals have souls, all plants have souls. The soul is the form of the body. And in fact, the word animal in English and in Latin comes from the Latin word anima, which means soul. So this panpsychism is a rediscovery or a repostulation of a kind of mind throughout nature. There were two famous panpsychist philosophers in the 17th century, both of them reacting against Descartes. One was Leibniz, who suggested that all self-organizing units have bodies and minds, that each reflects the universe from its own point of view. He called them monads. The other was Spinoza, who thought that the whole of nature was essentially the body of God, and God was the mind of nature. It was a kind of pantheist philosophy. The most interesting animist or panpsychist philosopher in the 20th century was Alfred North Whitehead, who was writing in the 1920s, a British philosopher, who talked in terms of the philosophy of organism. The universe is not a machine, it's an organism. Whitehead was a mathematician as well as a philosopher, and was one of the first people to appreciate how radical quantum theory was. In the 1920s, he got it. Most people took decades to get that what a radical break this was from traditional physics. Quantum theory says that electrons and atoms and protons are not just little bits of stuff. They're not solid bits of matter like small billiard balls. They're waves. They're waves, they're processes in time. And a wave cannot exist at an instant because it takes time to wave. it can't exist at a point in space because it takes space to wave in. You cannot have an instantaneous wave. That's at root the reason for the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. Whitehead realized that if electrons and protons and atoms were waves, they were processes in time. They were processes, not things. And if they were processes, they had a past and a future. That was going from the past towards the future. He then came up with an extremely interesting idea which still hasn't been fully worked out. It's just begun to be discussed again. And that is that this nature of matter as time, in time, gives us a new way of thinking about the relation of mind and body. Old views of mind and body relationship are that the mind's somehow inside and the body and the outer world are out there. We talk about the inner life and the outer world. These are spatial metaphors. But he thought the relation of mind and body was a relationship in time, not space. The mind, he thought, was the future pole, like in a polarity between the past and the future. The mind was the future pole, and the body is the past pole. The mind is concerned with possibilities, and these possibilities are not actual because they don't become actual until there's a decision, and one of them becomes actual. As soon as it becomes actual, it's measurable, it's a fact, but it's in the past. For example, in the case of an electron, if you want to know what an electron will do, you work out the Schrödinger equation of quantum mechanics, which tells you all the possible things that electron could do. It's a description of possibilities. That's like the mind of the electron. It's got all these possible things. When the electron interacts with a physical measuring instrument or with a photographic film or an atom or molecule, when it interacts with anything, these possibilities collapse down and become an actual action. This is sometimes called the collapse of the wave function. These possibilities collapse down and become an observable fact. But that's instantly in the past, and now a new set of possibilities open up. Now, our minds are like that too. Our minds are concerned, our conscious minds are arenas of possibility. Thoughts, images, plans, intentions are possibilities in our minds. Dreams are a kind of possibility too. A lot of our conscious activity is considering alternative possibilities and choosing among them. For example, all of us chose to be here tonight. The fact we're here now, we made that decision and put it into practice, means it's an observable, objective fact that we're in this room. We can be seen, measured, photographed, etc. There was a time when we were making up our minds. We could have done other things. We could have been elsewhere this evening. There were other possibilities for this evening. But when we made the decision among all those possibilities to do this one, then this is what happens. It's an observable fact, but it's now in the past. And our minds are opening again to new possibilities, which after all is what this talk is about. So the role of consciousness is about choice and possibility. Our habits are largely unconscious because we don't need to make choices. So this idea of mind-body relations gives us a completely different view of the way nature works. The mental causation is a stream of causation working from the future towards the past, whereas physical causation of the kind we're familiar with from physics works from the past towards the future. Again, in the Middle Ages, in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas and in the philosophy of Aristotle, to explain everything, you had to have not just the physical cause and the matter of which something's made, you also had to have the goal or the intention towards which something was attracted. Everything in nature was attracted towards a goal, according to Aristotle. A growing animal or plant is attracted towards the goal of reaching its mature form. A hungry dog is attracted towards the goal of eating some meat, finding a bone. It's goal-directed behavior. And this purposive or teleological activity involves a kind of stream of causation from a virtual future towards the present. So this way of thinking about the mind fits with a quite sophisticated and well-developed philosophy, which has been rejected in favor of the mechanistic theory of just matter and energy, but which makes much more sense of mind and consciousness. I want to turn now to the doctrine that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, because what this doctrine tells us is that our minds are just inside our heads. It's all in the brain. Instead, I think that it makes more sense to think of minds as being like fields which are spread out in space and time. We're used to the idea of a magnet being a physical object with an invisible field around it, a region of influence, the magnetic field. We're used to the idea of the Earth having a gravitational field inside it and stretching out invisibly far beyond the Earth, keeping the Moon in its orbit. We're familiar with mobile phones, which have electromagnetic fields inside the material phone, but they stretch out invisibly far beyond the telephone. So fields are an accepted part of modern physics, but they're not exactly matter. They're physical, but not material. Materialists expand their view to say, okay, we'll include fields as well. They used to think they were material, made of matter, the ether. Now they don't. But anyway, I'm not discussing that particular point. What I'm discussing is how the best to think of our minds. Are they just material things, like mechanical systems, just based on contact? Or are they field-like systems, which means they could stretch out far beyond our brains, just like many purely physical systems like magnets and mobile phones do? Well, I think they stretch out beyond our brains. I think our minds are extended far beyond our brains. The easiest way to understand this is to think about the nature of vision. What happens when you see me standing here now? You all know the standard answer. Light's reflected from me, it goes through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, goes through the lens, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerve, and activity in various regions of the brain. And we now know which regions become active in more detail than ever before, thanks to brain scanners. But does that explain vision? Well, no, it doesn't. It just describes what happens in the brain when you're seeing something. It doesn't explain why you're conscious of what you see. There's nothing in neurophysiology that tells you this is conscious. It doesn't tell you that why you're conscious of what you see, and that, in fact, is an aspect of the hard problem. Consciousness itself is unexplained. But the second question is the one I want to focus on. Where is this happening? When you see me now, where is your image of me? The official view is that it's inside your brain. All your thoughts, all your experience is inside your head. So somewhere inside your head, there's a little Rupert looking just like me, but it's in your head. Everything you're seeing in this room is inside your head. If you look at the stars at night, the stars you're seeing in the sky, the experience of those stars is inside your head. Your skull is beyond the stars. That is the official worldview taken to its logical conclusion. What I'd like to suggest is something so simple that it's hard to understand. And that is that your image of what you see is where it seems to be. Your image of me is located right here. It's in your mind, but it's not inside your brain. Everything you see is being projected out to where it seems to be. It's a projection. It's a kind of virtual reality projection created by your mind, depending on the activity of the brain and on what comes into the eyes. But it's not inside the brain. You don't have a little three-dimensional virtual reality display inside your head. No one's ever seen one there, but the official view is that's what's going on. What I'm suggesting is this projection, this three-dimensional colored world you're experiencing is projected out to where things are. Sometimes it's projected to where they are not, and then you're having an illusion or a hallucination. But fortunately, those are rare. None of us would survive long if we were living entirely in a hallucinatory world. Your mind reaches out to project a kind of visual field to what you're seeing. So every one of you, as I look at you, are images in my mind which is projecting out to you where you are. Now, is this just a philosophical view? Well, it is a philosophical view. It's how Plato thought vision worked. It's how Euclid thought that vision worked. And in fact, Euclid was the first person to explain how mirrors work. He showed that if we project things out, just like I'm saying, the great Greek geometer said, if we project things out, when we look in a mirror, because these are mental projections, they go straight through the glass. They're not physical. They don't bounce off the mirror. They go straight through. That's why you see everything behind the mirror, what science calls virtual images. They're projected. Every time you look at anything in a mirror, you're seeing your own projections. That's what you're seeing. It's still the official theory of mirrors, although it doesn't fit very well with the mind as in the brain theory. But can this be tested more radically? If I look at you from behind and you don't know that I'm there, is it possible that when my mind touches you through reaching out to see you, you could feel my attention? Is it possible that people, when they're stared at from behind, could feel that somebody was looking at them? That ought not to happen according to regular science, and according to official psychology textbooks, it doesn't happen, it's impossible. But if you actually ask yourself and your friends, have you ever felt when you're being looked at from behind? You'll find that yes, this is a common experience. Surveys show that more than 95% of the population have had this experience, including children. And also, the great majority of people have had the converse experience, staring at somebody from behind and seeing that person turn around and look at them. There's a slight sex difference in these results. More women than men have experienced being stared at, and more men than women have experienced staring at others and making them turn around. Nevertheless, members of both sexes are very familiar with this phenomenon, including children. What does science have to tell us about this? Well, until recently, nothing. The subject was such a strong taboo that it was not investigated throughout almost from about 1880 to 1985. There were only 4 published papers in the scientific literature on the subject. 2 of them were by skeptics saying it's rubbish, it shouldn't happen, and people ought not to believe it. 2 of them were by people who'd actually done some experiments and said, well, look, yes, it does seem to happen. So this is an experimental question. Does it happen? I'm a biologist, and I started looking at the natural history of this. I interviewed people whose job it is to watch others, surveillance officers, private detectives, the drug squad at Heathrow, the store detectives at Harrods, practical people who are paid to watch other people. Most of them take it for granted that this is a reality. When you're being trained how to follow somebody as a private detective, you're trained don't stare at their back because they'll feel you're looking at them. They'll turn around, catch your eye, and your cover's blown. This is just completely taken for granted. In the Japanese martial arts, people can actually be trained to become more sensitive to being looked at from behind. It's useful to know if someone's looking at you from behind, they might be trying to attack you. And if you can sense it, you'll escape better. Well, it can also be investigated experimentally, and I've developed some extremely simple experiments, so simple a child can do them, and in fact, thousands of children already have done them. This research has been done widely in schools in Britain, America, and Germany. One person sits with a blindfold, the others behind them, and in a random series of trials, they look or don't look at the back of their neck. And in each trial, the people have to guess if they're being looked at or not. They're right or wrong. By pure chance, they'd be right 55% of the time. The results are not that much above chance. In the looking trials, they're right about 60% of the time. It's a very artificial test. But it shows positive, significant results over hundreds of thousands of trials. An experiment of this kind has been running in the Amsterdam Science Museum for the last 20 years. one of the biggest experiments ever conducted, and it shows overwhelming statistical evidence that this really happens. Now, for most people, it's not surprising it really happens because they've experienced it in real life. You might think, well, the experiments need to be done more rigorously. Well, they have been through mirrors, through one-way mirrors, through windows, even through closed-circuit television. People's physiology changes measurably when they're stared at on closed-circuit television. So there's an influence even of someone seeing your image. You don't even have to see someone directly for this to work. It turns out this is very common among animals as well. They can tell when they're being stared at. Some people can tell when animals are staring at them, and so on. I think it probably evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. A prey animal that could tell when a predator was staring at it would have a better chance of surviving than one that couldn't tell. I think, therefore, that our minds reach out every time we look at something through attention. And the English word attention, from the Latin word ad tendere, which means ad means towards, tendere means to stretch. I think attention is our mind stretching towards something. It's closely related to intention, where our minds stretch into something. This too can have great effects. If I think about you and I want to get in touch with you, and I really need to talk to you, my intention is to telephone you, and I have the intention to call you. I go to my telephone, I dial your number, I try and call you, and quite often, you might have the experience, you suddenly start thinking about me for no apparent reason, and then say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you when you rang. This is an extremely common experience. More than 80% of people who've had experiences of apparent telephone telepathy, thinking of someone who then rings, or knowing who it is when the phone rings before looking at the caller ID. The standard explanation for this, the so-called skeptical explanation, is, oh, well, it's just coincidence. You think about people all the time. If one of them rings, you imagine it's telepathy, and you just forget all the times you're wrong. A reasonable hypothesis, but evidence-free. Science is about testing hypotheses, and I've actually tested that one in many experiments. In the basic experiment, you would, if you're the subject, you'd sit at home with a landline phone. You know it's an experiment. You've set aside time specially. You give us the names of 4 of your close friends or family members who you might be telepathic with. We pick one of the 4 at random, ring them up and say, please ring your friend after thinking about them for a minute or two, ring them very soon. They ring. Your phone rings. Before you pick it up, you're being filmed. You have to guess who it is. I think it's John. Hello, John. You're right or you're wrong. There's a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right by chance, 25%. In these tests, the hit rate is about 45%. It's massively significant statistically. It's artificial test. People aren't right every time, but much, much more significantly than chance. This research has now been replicated at the University of Freiburg in Germany and in the University of Amsterdam, Holland. And it's also the same kind of thing happens with text messages and emails. You think about you get a message from them. It shows we're interconnected. The commonest forms of telepathy in the modern world are ones that have developed along with technology. I help to emphasize, and they're happening more than they've ever happened before because people spend so much time using telephones nowadays. Now, these are psychic phenomena to do with the psyche or the soul. Psychic phenomena are common in animals. Many animals are telepathic with each other, and they're telepathic with their owners. I wrote a whole book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about dogs, cats, and other animals which are telepathic with their owners. Many people have found this, and I've shown that it's not just chance. When people come at random times in unfamiliar vehicles, animals can still know. We have all this on film. You can see films of these experiments on my website. So I think psychic phenomena show the mind is extended in space, to some extent in time as well, because we have precognitive dreams sometimes. But these are like the horizontal connections. They're connections to other people and to animals. These are not spiritual phenomena, they're psychic phenomena. There's a distinction between these realms. I myself think our minds are also open to spiritual phenomena, to the influence of the spiritual realm, which comes through spiritual practices, through prayer, through spontaneous mystical experiences, and is what religions and spiritual practices are all about. So I think our minds are more extensive than our brains in a spiritual dimension, as well as in a psychic and material dimension. The idea they're nothing but the brain, they're all inside the head, is a dogma. And it's a dogma that's imprisoned our civilization for a long time. There's no reason that we need to go on believing it. The scientific evidence for it is very small. The evidence for a more extended view of the mind is much greater. And it's quite liberating to think of your mind as being much more extensive than your brain. It makes much more sense of your own experiences. Well, my time's up, so I can't go on with any of the other dogmas, but I hope I've said enough to show that all these big assumptions that science are based on turn out to be entirely questionable, and when you question them, new possibilities open up, new scientific possibilities open up for inquiry. I think science will become much more exciting, much more interesting, much more fun, and probably a lot cheaper if we move in the direction that I'm suggesting here of questioning these fundamental dogmas and trying to go beyond them. I think we're on the threshold of an extremely exciting new phase of scientific discovery. Thank you.